comes a moment in the history of every nation when the chains of the past are shattered, not by force, but by an awakening of the human spirit. And that moment for India, the day the West lost control, was not just a date on a calendar. It was a rebirth. It was not when empires signed papers. It was when the soul of India rose from humiliation and declared, the West did not lose control in a battlefield. It lost control in the mind of the Indian man. The British Empire ruled for centuries not by guns, but by convincing the Indian that he was less than what he was, that his gods were inferior, his customs backward, his language uncivilized, his courage diminished. But there came a time when that illusion broke, when the Indian stopped bowing his head, when he stopped asking for permission to breathe with dignity. That is when the West truly lost control. They could not imprison the ideas of Swaraj. They could not silence the cry of Vande Mataram. They could not destroy the fire in a man like Bhagat Singh, nor the wisdom in a soul like Gandhi. They ruled the land, but the spirit of the people had already declared independence long before 1947. And let me remind you, true freedom is not given, it is taken. Freedom does not arrive wrapped in peace treaties and official stamps. It is claimed through sacrifice. It is won by the man who says, I would rather die on my feet than live on my knee. For centuries, India was governed not just by laws and armies, but by a far more sinister weapon, psychological submission. The West didn't conquer India merely through cannons or ships. They conquered it by planting a seed in the Indian mind, the seed of inferiority. This was the silent colonization, more dangerous than chains or bullets, because it made a man doubt his own worth, despise his own culture, and question his own roots. The British understood something vital. If you can convince a people that they are beneath you, they will govern themselves on your behalf. And so, the first and deepest wound inflicted on India was not physical, it was mental. They called our heritage primitive, our gods idols, our values outdated. They mocked the Indian way of life as disorganized, chaotic, and in need of Western order. And the worst part, slowly many began to believe them. An entire generation grew up learning that their ancestors were foolish, their traditions irrational, their languages inferior. English became not just a medium of communication, it became a marker of superiority. If you spoke it, you were civilized. If you didn't, you were native. This was not education, it was indoctrination. But then something extraordinary began to happen. The very people raised under this colonial conditioning began to ask questions. They began to read their own history, not through the eyes of the colonizer, but with the clarity of self-respect. Men and women across the country began to realize that they were not the children of weakness. They were the descendants of kings, sages, warriors, and poets. They were the civilization that gave the world a concept of zero, the wisdom of the Upanishads, and the discipline of yoga. A fire was lit, and that fire was not in the hands, it was in the mind. When the Indian stopped seeing himself as inferior, the empire began to tremble, because a man who knows his worth cannot be controlled. A man who walks with pride in his step, who looks you in the eye, who speaks his mother tongue without shame, that man is free, even if he lives under foreign rule. And when enough such men and women rise together, no empire can hold them down. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, painful, and often resisted by the very people who were still caught in the mental trap of colonialism. But it spread. It spread through poetry and protest, through spiritual leaders and school teachers, through revolutionaries and reformers. It whispered from the pages of Tagore, roared from the speeches of Vivekananda, and marched in the footsteps of Gandhi. Every time an Indian chose his dhoti over a suit, his village over a foreign city, his own values over borrowed ideologies, a piece of the colonial empire crumbled. The British knew it too. That's why they feared education, but not the kind they offered in their schools. They feared the awakening of the Indian mind. They feared the moment when the colonized would realize he was not broken, only blinded. They feared the day India would stop asking, "Am I enough?" and start declaring, "I am more than enough." Oh. And that day came, not on a battlefield, not in Parliament, not on a treaty paper, but in the quiet courage of the Indian spirit. The day the West lost control over India was not August 15, 1947. That was merely the final announcement. The real loss happened the day the Indian mind said, "No more. No more shame for the color of my skin. No more embarrassment for the way I pray. No more apologies for my culture, my food, my festivals, or my faith." Action shift in mindset was the true revolution. Because freedom begins long before the chains are broken. It begins the moment you stop believing you were meant to be chained. The moment a person reclaims the throne of his own mind, he dethrones every ruler who ever sat upon it. So if you want to honor the day the West lost control over India, don't just wave a flag. Think like a free man. Speak like a proud woman. Walk like you belong to a land that birthed civilizations. And above all, never, ever forget who you are. That memory is your greatest weapon. That pride is your greatest strength. And that realization, burning quietly in millions of hearts, is what truly ended the empire. Violence has always been the tool of empires. The West, with all its flags and fleets, ruled India through the force of arms, the crack of whips, and the echo of gunfire. They believed they could suppress the voice of a people by intimidating their bodies. And for a time, it seemed to work. Rebellions were crushed, freedom fighters hanged, and villages silenced. But what they never anticipated was the rise of a resistance that could not be shot, imprisoned, or broken. Nonviolent resistance. The moment Indians chose nonviolence as their weapon, the West began losing control, not over just the streets or cities, but over the very soul of the nation. Gandhi didn't walk into history with an army behind him. He didn't hold a sword, and he never commanded battalions. Yet the power he wielded was greater than that of any king. His weapon was the human conscience. When the Salt March began, when people refused to buy British cloth, when they sat silently in front of police lobbies and did not strike back, something radical occurred. The oppressor was exposed, not just to the world, but to himself. It is easy to strike someone who strikes back. It justifies retaliation. But it is far more unsettling, even humiliating, to strike a man who does not resist. Gandhi turned the mirror toward the empire, forcing it to see its brutality, its moral failure. The British were not afraid of riots. They were prepared for bloodshed. What they feared was dignity in the face of violence. That was something they had no answer to. When thousands filled the prisons instead of the streets, the jails became the battleground. When women once confined to homes marched with men to demand justice, the very social fabric transformed. When farmers refused to pay taxes and weavers spun their own cloth, the British economic machinery trembled. Nonviolence wasn't passivity. It was active, deliberate, and deeply strategic. It demanded more courage than war, more strength than rage, and more unity than any weapon could forge. Each protest, each satyagraha, each fast unto death was a message. You may control our land, but you cannot command our souls. And that frightened the empire more than any uprising could. They couldn't imprison everyone. They couldn't silence every chant. They couldn't stamp out the wildfire of civil disobedience that was spreading from village to village, mine to mine. The West prided itself on its so-called civilization. Yet when faced with a nation that fought with truth, peace, and self-respect, they appear not as civilizers, but as tyrants. Cameras began to capture the brutality. Newspapers began reporting the injustice. And the world, watching closely, began to shift its sympathy. But beyond the global spotlight, something more powerful was happening within India itself. Nonviolence redefined the identity of the Indian people. No longer victims, they became warriors of truth. No longer slaves, they became architects of their future. The power dynamic had shifted. The rulers now lived in fear, not of revolt, but of exposure, of being seen for what they were. It was not just Gandhi who carried this torch. Millions followed his path. Schoolboys were jailed for shouting slogans. Women hid revolutionaries in their homes. Farmers gave up their crops. Lawyers gave up their careers. The entire nation became a movement, not fueled by hate, but by a deep love for justice. And that love, steady, unwavering, and willing to suffer without submission, became the most powerful force against tyranny. The British could never comprehend it. They ruled with iron, but India fought with spirit. They used laws to bind, but India used truth to liberate. In that moral war, they were already defeated long before they left. The day the British realized they could no longer provoke violence was the day they lost their control. For an empire built on domination, nothing is more terrifying than a people who do not fear pain, who do not respond with vengeance, and who will walk into jails rather than walk away from justice. That day marked a new definition of strength. Strength that did not roar, but endured. Strength that did not destroy, but transformed. Strength that did not seek revenge, but demanded respect. And that strength, born from the Indian soul, lit the path not only to independence, but to a new vision of what it means to be truly free. The West may have had guns, but India had truth. And truth, once awakened, cannot be conquered. There comes a time in the life of every nation when the people stop waiting for change and start becoming the change. That moment in India's freedom struggle was ignited not by speeches or negotiations, but by the fearless heartbeat of its youth. When men like Bhagat, Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Ram Prasad Bismil, and countless unnamed revolutionaries rose and declared that they would rather die than submit to foreign rule, it shook the very foundation of the British Empire. Liberation, it was a deliberate declaration. We are not afraid of your bullets. We are afraid of dying as slaves. The power of their actions did not come from numbers or weapons. It came from conviction. At an age when most young men chase comfort, careers, or applause, these warriors chose to chase freedom, knowing full well it would cost them their lives. Bhagat Singh, barely 23, kissed the gallows with a smile. He wrote letters to the world from prison, not seeking pity, but pouring wisdom into every sentence. He was not just a rebel with a bomb. He was a thinker, a philosopher, a visionary. His martyrdom did more than end a life. It awakened millions. The British could handle protests. They could manage diplomacy. But what they could not handle was a generation that no longer feared death. When revolutionaries turned every prison cell into a classroom and every execution into a legend, the empire lost something vital: control over fear. Because it is fear that keeps a people in chains, and when fear is gone, power becomes hollow. It wasn't just the actions of the revolutionaries. It was the impact they had on the national psyche. Young people across India began to believe that they too could make a difference. Courage spread like wildfire. The stories of these heroes traveled from town to village, from whisper to roar, inspiring others to stand taller, speak louder, and fight harder. The British wanted to crush a rebellion, but they unintentionally lit a revolution. This was not the revolution of ideology alone. It was spiritual. It touched the soul of the nation. It reminded people that slavery is not just a condition, it is a choice. And once that choice is rejected, freedom is inevitable. The martyrs did not wait for policy changes or global sympathy. They understood that if people are willing to die for their dignity, they cannot be ruled by outsiders. Chandrasekhar Azad vowed never to be captured alive, and he kept his word. Surrounded, wounded, and cornered, he chose to use his final bullet on himself, rather than let the British parade him in chains. That moment was not a death, it was a message. A message that said, "I belong to a soil that will not bow." His name, Azad, meaning free, became more than a name. It became a prophecy for the entire nation. Their bravery wasn't about violence. It was about resistance. They never killed for pleasure. They never hated blindly. They fought because submission was not an option. They were not consumed by anger, but driven by purpose. And that purpose was simple: to awaken a nation that had been lulled into silence, to stir a people who had forgotten their strength. Even those who followed the path of nonviolence were deeply moved by the courage of these revolutionaries. Gandhi may not have agreed with their methods, but he never questioned their love for the nation. In truth, India's freedom struggle was not a conflict between ideologies. It was a symphony of sacrifices, each playing its part. The masses carried the torch, and the leaders gave it direction. The British could exile leaders, they could ban assemblies, but they could not kill an idea. And the idea that India was meant to be free was now too deeply rooted in every heart, too passionately defended by every martyr, and too loudly echoed in every home. The day the revolutionaries chose death over submission was the day the British Empire began to fall. Because empires do not fall when leaders are overthrown. They fall when the youth no longer accept their lies, when the brave no longer accept their limits, and when the oppressed no longer accept their fate. India's independence was not gifted by negotiations. It was paid for by blood. blood that watered the tree of liberty, whose roots run deep into the soul of this nation. That legacy is not one of victimhood, but of valor. And every time you remember Bhagat Singh's smile or Azad's final stand, remember this: freedom is never given. It is seized by those who are willing to give everything for it. The brilliance of India's resistance was not only found in its spirit, but also in its strategy. The British Empire did not just conquer India through force. They maintained control through systems of law, education, administration, and language. They ruled not only with soldiers, but with clerks, judges, and bureaucrats. They taught Indians their own tongue, crafted legal codes to maintain their dominance, and designed institutions to serve their interests. And for a time it worked. Indians who wanted to rise in society were told they had to become more like the British, speak their language, follow their rules, adopt their mannerisms. But what the British didn't realize was that they were training their own undoing. Because India did more than learn the systems, it mastered them, then turned them against the empire. The British introduced English to create a class of intermediaries, Indians who would think like the West, obey like servants, and manage their own people on behalf of the crown. But what they ended up creating was a generation of intellectual warriors. Indians like Jawaharlal Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar, and Subhas Chandra Bose didn't just learn English. They used it to speak to the world. They wrote, debated, argued, and challenged the logic of colonialism in the very language of the colonizer. They took the courtroom and transformed it into a battlefield of justice. They took Western education and used it to unmask the hypocrisy of the empire. In trying to civilize the Indian, the British had unknowingly given him the tools to dismantle the very civilization they boasted of. This was the turning point, when Indians began to use the weapons of intellect, law, and communication more skillfully than their masters. Every debate in the legislature, every petition in court, every protest letter to the viceroy was a blow to the colonial ego. India had ceased to be a silent subject. She was now speaking in the language of authority, yet with a purpose that opposed that authority at its core. And it wasn't just in the halls of power. In villages, towns, and cities, ordinary Indians began to organize. They started schools, ran newspapers, set up associations. The very systems the British built to control were now being redirected toward liberation. It was like the empire had dug a trench, only to find itself being buried in it by the very people it sought to dominate. In education, this reversal was even more visible. Indians began to realize that their ancient texts, philosophies, sciences, and values had been dismissed as inferior, not because they were outdated, but because they were dangerous. Dangerous to a narrative that portrayed the West as the savior of a primitive land. Once Indians began to revisit their own knowledge through the lens of self-respect, they found something astonishing. They had never been backward, only misrepresented. Sanskrit scholars debated European professors. Ayurvedic doctors challenged Western medicine. Historians dug into archives and brought forth a version of India that was proud, advanced, and deeply rooted in culture and dignity. This intellectual resurgence was not violent, but it was revolutionary, because knowledge is power, and India was reclaiming its power, paragraph by paragraph, speech by speech, judgment by judgment. Even the Indian press, often censored, became a force of defiance. Editors risked prison to publish the truth. Writers used metaphors and allegories to stir the hearts of readers. Every page printed in resistance was a nail in the coffin of colonial propaganda. By the time independence was on the horizon, the British found themselves increasingly irrelevant in the very systems they had once monopolized. Indian judges, lawyers, teachers, and administrators were running the country. The question was no longer if the British would leave, but why they were still here at all. The machinery of governance no longer belonged to them. The narrative no longer served them. The people no longer feared them. This was the silent revolution, where the colonized outgrew the colonizer, not through violence, but through mastery, not through imitation, but through transformation. When India proved that it could run the British-made machine better than the British themselves, the empire lost its claim to moral authority. And once moral authority is gone, no throne can stand for long. So remember this: freedom isn't just won on the battlefield. It is also won in the classroom, the courtroom, the newsroom. India's intellectual revolt was not loud, but it was lethal. And when the mind becomes independent, the body follows. That is how India turned the master's tools into weapons of liberation. And that is when the West truly lost control. Empires do not survive on military strength alone. They thrive on profit. The British Empire in particular was a business masquerading as a kingdom. Its foundation in India was not just political domination, but economic exploitation. They came for trade, but they stayed to plunder. From the textile industry in Bengal to the spice routes of the south, the British siphoned wealth systematically, turning a land of abundance into a nation of beggars. What truly weakened their grip wasn't a military campaign. It was when ordinary Indians began to understand this system and chose to reject it. The moment India fought the empire with economic resistance, the British began to lose their most powerful weapon: control over the Indian wallet. It began with something as simple as a piece of cloth. The British imported machine-made textiles into India, killing the native handloom industry. Indian artisans, once the pride of global trade, were reduced to poverty. But then came the movement of Swadeshi. Not just a slogan, but a silent revolution. Led by visionaries like Gandhi, the Swadeshi movement urged Indians to boycott British goods. It wasn't just about economic independence. It was about reclaiming identity, dignity, and self-respect. The act of spinning khadi became symbolic. When Gandhi sat with a spinning wheel, he was not just making thread. He was unmaking an empire. Every thread spun by hand was a thread taken away from British mills. Every yard of khadi worn was a blow to the foreign cloth merchants. And every time an Indian refused to buy British salt, refused to drink foreign tea, or refused to pay unfair taxes, it signaled the crumbling of a once mighty economic empire. The British laughed at first. They called the boycott primitive, ineffective. But soon their own records began to show the impact. Import numbers dropped. British merchants complained. Industries suffered. Suddenly the empire realized it wasn't just facing protests. It was facing a people who had decided to starve the beast instead of feeding it. Economic resistance is the hardest to fight because it is quiet. It doesn't require crowds or slogans. It requires discipline, unity, and patience. It requires the consumer to become the warrior. And when millions of Indians began making conscious decisions about what they would or wouldn't buy, the empire started to bleed financially. What armies could not achieve, a boycott began to accomplish. This movement also brought new life to Indian industries. Homegrown businesses started emerging again. Weavers found work. Artisans found purpose. The local economy slowly began to rise, not under colonial control, but under indigenous effort. It was not just resistance, it was rebirth. And in that rebirth, India began to see what it could be, without the shadow of the West looming over its markets. But the economic battle was also deeply personal. It wasn't always easy to give up cheaper, more available foreign goods. It required sacrifice. It required commitment. It required Indians to ask themselves what matters more, comfort or country. And time after time, millions chose the harder road because they believed that every rupee spent on British goods was a bullet against their own people. Women played a massive role in this economic revolution. They boycotted foreign cosmetics, burned foreign clothes, and taught the next generation to take pride in Indian products. Students dropped out of British institutions. Businessmen refused to import. Street vendors sold only Swadeshi items. The whole nation, from the rich to the poor, turned consumption into resistance. And what could the British do? They couldn't force people to buy their goods. They couldn't jail an entire nation for refusing to spend. They couldn't legislate loyalty. And so, the foundation of their control, the wealth extracted from Indian soil and sweat, began to collapse. By the time independence came, the economic message was clear. India no longer needed the West to survive. In fact, it thrived in the absence of colonial interference. The empire had come for profits, but left with losses, material, moral, and spiritual. This form of resistance holds lessons even today. True independence is not just about flying a flag. It is about owning your labor, your land, your trade, and your choices. When India chose Swadeshi, it wasn't just saying no to British goods. It was saying yes to self-respect. That decision, repeated millions of times in millions of small acts, became one of the strongest blows to the empire. And that is how empires fall. Not always with explosions, but with decisions. With a people who choose to stop feeding the machine. When India chose its own economy over exploitation, the West lost not just control, but justification. And from that moment on, their days in India were numbered. There is a difference between a nation that wins its freedom and one that defines its identity. For India, independence from the West was not just about removing foreign rulers, it was about reclaiming the soul of a civilization. Long before the British left, something far more powerful had already occurred. India had begun to rediscover and redefine who it truly was. The day the West lost control over India was not marked by flags or parades. It was the day Indians no longer needed Western validation to feel proud of who they were. It was the day India declared its own identity to the world, not as an imitation of Europe, but as a force rooted in its own unmatched depth, diversity, and strength. For years, colonizers had fed a narrative that India was primitive and in need of Western enlightenment. They portrayed its culture as chaotic, its religions as superstitious, and its people as incapable of governing themselves. This wasn't just physical colonization, it was cultural erasure. British rule tried to convince the Indians that to be civilized, they had to become like the West. And for a time, many believed it. They wore English suits, spoke the Queen's language, and measured success by how well they could mirror their rulers. But there came a moment, subtle yet seismic, when India stopped asking, "Am I good enough?" and started declaring, "I have always been more than enough." That awakening was the true loss of control for the West. Because once a nation sees its own reflection clearly, no empire can convince it otherwise. The rediscovery of Indian identity began with a return to its roots. Thinkers, poets, spiritual leaders, and scholars started to explore and elevate the wisdom that had been ignored or ridiculed. The Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the teachings of Buddha and Mahavira, the art of ancient India, the architecture of temples and forts, all were re-examined, not with shame but with awe. People began to realize that the foundations of their culture were not backward relics, but timeless treasures. India had given the world zero, surgery, yoga, astronomy, and philosophy, centuries before Europe even awakened to science. Swami Vivekananda's speech in Chicago in 1893 was not just a moment of pride. It was a thunderclap that echoed across continents. He didn't beg for respect. He demanded it by showing the world the vastness of Indian thought. Rabindranath Tagore, through his poetry and music, brought Indian ascetics to the global stage. These weren't appeals for recognition. They were declarations of presence. The West was no longer the only voice in the room. Even the Indian freedom movement, while political in form, was deeply cultural in spirit. Gandhi's insistence on village industries, on Indian attire, on non-Western principles of resistance was not just strategic, it was philosophical. He was saying, we will not only be free, we will be free as ourselves. That's what made the British nervous. Because once India decided it would rise as India, not as a shadow of the West, it became unstoppable. When a nation stops trying to fit into someone else's mold, it begins to build its own. That's what post-colonial India began to do. The Constitution was not a copy of Britain's, it was a blend. Modern yet rooted, progressive yet respectful of tradition. India chose to be a democracy not because the West told it to, but because its own spiritual traditions had long upheld values of discussion, pluralism, and tolerance. India's films, music, languages, fashion, and festivals began to surge with pride again. No longer did people hide their names or accents to sound Western. No longer did Indian art need to be justified by European approval. The country had begun to walk in its own skin with confidence, not apology. And that is when the West truly lost control. Because the people who know who they are and who do not seek permission to be themselves cannot be ruled. The British could govern land, but they could not govern the soul. The day that soul stood up and said, I am Bharat, the empire became irrelevant. This is the highest form of freedom, not just political or economic, but spiritual and cultural. When identity is no longer for sale, no foreign power can ever own a nation again. India did not simply win back land in 1947, it won back something far more precious. Its reflection, its dignity, its voice. And that voice now speaks to the world, not in borrowed phrases, but in its own bold, timeless tone.